So these issues aside, I am ready to cut my fabric off the loom, and I want to show you what it looks like because it tends to make people go, wow, or oh, she's taking scissors to hand woven fabric. I'm actually not going to cut the fabric. I have woven I guess I'll call it a footer at the end of my project in a contrast yarn, and I even hem stitched it. Uh, and all these little tails I will fix after wet finishing. But let's see what happens when I remove the fabric from the loom. And in fact, I'm going to cut behind the rigid heddle uh, so that you so that if I choose to do a twisted fringe on this, which seems less and less likely by the minute, I've got some length to work with. Oh, another point I want to make about before I start cutting. When you're weaving on a rigid heddle loom that's been direct warped, if you have one broken warp end, wherever it is, you're going to get a looser warp end as it goes around that back apron bar. It's just the nature of the beast. And a final thing before I start cutting, otherwise these things are going to fall to the floor. I did have a loose warp thread in the middle of my weaving, and to compensate for that is super easy. Everybody gets loose warp threads. They are not the sign of anything dire. It's just, we're humans. Stuff happens. And I just grabbed two of these S hooks and hung them off the back of the loom together as a little bit of weight. And then my shed was nice and clean. All right, commence with the cutting, Deb. Stop talking and cut. Cut, 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 cut. You don't have to be super fanatical about cutting in a straight line when you're cutting off the back of a loom, but it is good to be relatively consistent. So I just used this back beam as my guide. Okay, and now I've just undone the two ratchet dogs on the cloth beam. I'm pulling the cloth through the petals. And the fact that I'm having to fight so hard, even on this very fine warp thread, to get the thread back through the holes, suggests, yeah, that might have indeed have been part of my problem. Okay, and now I'm just unwinding, unwinding, unwinding. Now, what's great about this moment is you get to see what all the cloth looks like. And despite the headaches I created for myself on this project, I do still love these colors together. I love this technique. I love how overall the cloth has turned out. I love all the slubs in my blue-gray yarn because they add so much surface interest to what's going on. Oh, and here is where you can see. Here's where I first had a selvage break, but after I wet, and two of them at the same time, and they might have been connected to each other for all I know. When I have got this cloth wet finished and dried, I will just trim these ends down right at the surface of the cloth, and nobody but, say, a judge in a weaving contest would ever know that they'd been a problem. Okay, so here I am back at the front. And again, because it's possible, though not likely, but possible, that I will want to do a twisted fringe on this fabric, I am going to take the time, instead of cutting here, to just undo all my knots. And that's going to take a little while, so I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing. But it's simply a matter of just undoing each little bundle at the front of the loom. And now I've got enough length that if I wanted to do some kind of fringy finish, I would have more of that. I would have even more once I pick out this header that I wove to check my tension. So this doesn't take very long. And I'm getting there, getting there, getting there. And again, if I had planned this fabric not to have any fringe of any kind, if it was just going to be hemmed or something, I wouldn't bother untying. I could just cut across. What always is a good idea, and I did it at the footer, but I didn't do it at the header, is to spend some time when you start weaving, your real fabric, which is to say not your header, to do some hem stitching, because that way, even if the header slides off of your warp ends, which is really easy to do, uh, you've got your weft protected, and you're not going to lose oodles and oodles of effort because the warp is starting to slide right off the weft is starting to slide right off the warp. Okay, almost done, almost done. And this part really is very exciting because now, for the first time, when I pull this up, and away off the loom, I will get the full effect of my hand woven fabric. Okay, so the first thing I actually want to do is try and get a sense of whether my measurements that I just showed you on the cloth beam are really what I'm seeing, or whether tension was causing any issues. And again, this is the front part of this is what I wove at the beginning of the fabric. So I'm going to put that on the bottom so that we can see the difference in width. Okay. And now when I line up these selvages, this would be a lot easier to do on a solid surface as opposed to a loom, which is mostly open air. But let's try doing it on the heddle as a table. Okay, so my left selvages are together, and yeah, look at that. That's almost an inch and a half. So I suspect that if I had paid closer attention, and the minute I started to see problems with my draw in, I had stopped and unpicked everything back to the wider part of the weaving. And that might have meant actually taking out this whole yellow section, the first place where I did the clasped weft technique, and doing it over again. I think I would have had a happier experience weaving off this whole length. Also, too, you can see the line of the selvage. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. You can see the line of the selvage going, meow. So what I decided while I was finishing up today uh, and getting ready to take this fabric off the loom is I am not going to try to use this for a wrap unless, and even this is doubtful, unless I choose to do a selvage disguising technique. But even if I do that, and what might that look like? That might just be a crocheted edge along each side of the wrap, the whole length of the wrap. Um, even there, though, I'm still going to have that inch and a half difference between the width of the fabric at this end and the width of the fabric when I first started weaving. So now I need to switch gears and plan for a project, plan to use this cloth in a project where the selvages won't be seen. Yeah, it's kind of a cheap trick, but it's way better than losing all the hours and hours I put into this. So this took me over a month to weave, largely because I was doing a lot of knitting and dyeing in between. Normally, a rigid heddle project does not take anywhere near that long. I did learn that clasped weft with really, really fine weft yarns is super duper slow to weave because it just is. These are really skinny yarns, even at doubled width, and it just seemed to take forever. But it almost never takes me this long to get a project, even with fine yarns, off the rigid heddle loom. So now it's time for me to evaluate the cloth for other simple technical difficulties. Like, for instance, here I have an unintentional float where these weft yarns needed to go under instead of over the shed. And this is an easy fix. Basically, I'm going to thread a needle with a long-ish length of my weft yarn and just start maybe 2 inches over from where the float begins and stop maybe 2 inches over from where it ends, weave in correctly with my needle, and then just cut these ends. And then after I wet finish the cloth, just trim them. Uh, but you could see how these colors and these slubs have made for a really, whoops, that is not visible anymore, made for a really interesting fabric. And I do love this fabric. So now, as I consider what I had intended to use the fabric for, in other words, its function, I can recalibrate and think about, well, how else could I use this fabric? And I've got some ideas, but I'm not going to make any final decisions until I wet finish this. So the weft yarns are not going to change significantly from the wet finishing project. What I'll do is soak this for, actually, I'm probably likely to go up to an hour, because the weft yarns have a lot of silk, and silk really resists water. So I want to make sure it's nice and wet. So I'll soak this for an hour, probably with some wool wash. Then I will roll it in a towel and let it sit for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, so that the towel is nice and damp. Then I will stick the towel and the fabric into the dryer and check it religiously every 5 minutes to make sure nothing is happening, because those weft yarns aren't going to, nothing's going to happen to them, but stuff is definitely going to happen to this mostly wool warp yarn. And I did test my little sample square that I wove on my Zoom loom, but that's not really a big enough piece to see broad patterns. So I don't know what's going to happen. And again, this is why it would have been wiser if I weren't trying to uh, keep as much of the yarn unused as possible. And I've got yarn left over, so I really should have done this. I should have woven a big-ish sample and wet finished it before I warped up the whole loom. That would have been the safest way for me to understand what's going to happen in this next step.